The morning sun painted the Arizona territory in shades of gold and copper as Ayanna moved silently through the mesquite brush. Her moccasined feet made no sound on the rocky ground, and her dark eyes scanned the horizon with the practiced awareness of someone born to this harsh but beautiful land. She was 19 summers old, daughter of Nalnish, a respected medicine man among the Chiricahua Apache. Her name meant eternal blossom, and those who knew her understood why her parents had chosen it. The year was 1882, and the world Ayanna had known since childhood was changing faster than the seasons. White settlers had been trickling into the territory for years, but now they came in steady streams, bringing cattle, farms, and towns where once only Apache families had lived. Her people had been forced onto reservations, though some bands still moved freely through the mountains they had always called home. The tension between the two worlds felt as real as the desert heat. Ayanna carried a woven basket on her arm, searching for the healing plants her father needed for his medicine. Prickly pear cactus for wounds, desert sage for purification ceremonies, and the rare ghost flower that bloomed only in the coolest shadows of the canyon walls. She had been walking since before dawn, following the ancient paths her grandmother had taught her, paths that led to the secret places where the strongest medicine grew. As she rounded a large boulder, she heard something that made her freeze. The sound of metal striking stone echoed from the canyon ahead, rhythmic and purposeful. Someone was digging or mining. Her heart quickened. This was Apache land, sacred land where her ancestors had gathered healing plants for generations. No white man should be here. She crept forward, moving from shadow to shadow until she could peer around a rock outcropping. Below her, in a small clearing beside a seasonal stream, a man worked alone with a pickaxe and shovel. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled at his collar. His clothes were simple but well-made, the kind worn by settlers rather than soldiers or miners. A horse stood nearby, drinking from the stream. Ayanna watched him work. He moved with purpose, but without the desperate hunger she had seen in gold seekers. His movements were careful, almost respectful of the ground he disturbed. After each few strikes with the pickaxe, he would stop and examine what he had uncovered, sometimes putting stones back exactly where he had found them. Her curiosity overcame her caution. She had to know what this man was doing in her sacred place. Moving closer, she positioned herself where she could see but remain hidden. The man had stopped digging and was kneeling beside a small hole, gently brushing dirt from something with his hands. "Come out where I can see you." Ayanna's blood turned cold. The man had spoken without looking up from his work, his voice calm and steady. He had known she was there. "I mean no harm," he continued, still not turning around. "I know you've been watching me for the past 10 minutes. If you wanted to put an arrow in me, you would have done it by now." For a moment, Ayanna considered melting back into the rocks and disappearing. But something in his voice, a tone of respect rather than threat, made her step forward into the open. The man turned slowly, and when their eyes met, Ayanna felt something she had never experienced before. His eyes were the color of winter sky, blue-gray like storm clouds, and they held intelligence and kindness. He was younger than she had thought, perhaps 25 summers, with strong hands and a face marked by sun and wind. "I am Thomas Brennan," he said, rising slowly to his feet but keeping his hands visible. "And I believe I owe you an apology for disturbing this place." Ayanna said nothing, studying his face for signs of deception. She had learned early that white men's words often meant nothing, but this one felt different. He waited patiently for her to speak, not demanding or pushing, just waiting. "You speak as if you know this land is special," she finally said in careful English. Her voice carried only the slightest accent, the result of years spent learning the white man's language from a missionary teacher. Thomas nodded toward the hole he had been digging. I'm a surveyor, sent to map this region for the territorial government. But when I saw this place, he gestured to the stream, the ancient petroglyphs on the canyon walls, the way the light fell through the rocks. I realized I was standing somewhere sacred. I was trying to put everything back the way I found it. Ayanna moved closer, her basket still on her arm. She could see that he had indeed been carefully replacing stones and smoothing the disturbed earth. In the small hole, something glinted in the sunlight. "What did you find?" she asked. Thomas knelt again and gently lifted a small object from the earth. It was a piece of pottery, ancient and delicate, painted with symbols that made Ayanna's breath catch in her throat. "This belonged to my ancestors," she whispered, reaching out to touch the curved shard. "These symbols, they tell of a vision quest my great-grandmother completed here." "Then it should stay here," Thomas said immediately, offering the pottery piece to her. "I was going to bury it again anyway." Their fingers touched as she took the pottery, and Ayanna felt a shock like lightning run up her arm. Thomas must have felt it too, because his eyes widened slightly, and he held her gaze a moment longer than proper. "You are not like other white men," Ayanna said, cradling the precious shard. "And you are not what I expected to find in these mountains," Thomas replied. "Though I confess, I don't know what I expected." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of their different worlds hanging between them. Ayanna knew she should leave. Her father would be angry if he knew she was speaking with a white surveyor. Her people had good reason to distrust those who came to measure and map their land, for maps led to claims, and claims led to loss. But something about Thomas Brennan made her hesitate. He had stopped his work to preserve a piece of pottery. He had called this place sacred and meant it. And when he looked at her, she didn't see the contempt or fear she usually found in white men's eyes. "Why are you really here?" she asked. "Surveyors usually travel in groups, with soldiers for protection." Thomas sat on a fallen log beside the stream, gesturing for her to join him if she wished. Ayanna remained standing, but she didn't move away. "I requested to work alone," he said. "I'm good at my job, and I know how to take care of myself. But mainly, I wanted to see this land as it really is, not filtered through the fears and prejudices of others." "And what do you see?" "Beauty, history, a land that holds memories in every stone." He picked up a handful of dirt and let it sift through his fingers. "I see a place that doesn't belong to anyone, but that everyone belongs to, if that makes sense." It did make sense to Ayanna, more than he could know. It was exactly how her grandmother had taught her to think about their homeland. "Your people would not agree," she said. "They see land to be claimed, divided, sold." "Some do," Thomas admitted, "but not all. I've seen what happens when we try to force the land to be something it's not. I've seen farms fail because they were planted in places that never should have been farmed. I've seen towns built where the water runs out every summer." Ayanna studied his face as he spoke. There was sadness there, and something that looked like guilt. "You have seen much for such a young man." "I came west with my family when I was 16, Thomas said. "My father believed all the stories about free land and easy money. We claimed a section near Tucson and tried to farm it. The first year was good, but then the rain stopped. The second year, we lost everything. The third year, my parents died of fever." "I am sorry," Ayanna said, and meant it. She understood loss. "I learned to survey because I never wanted to see another family make the same mistakes. If I can map the land accurately, show where the water really is, where crops can actually grow, maybe I can prevent some suffering." They talked through the morning as the sun climbed higher in the canyon. Thomas asked questions about the plants in her basket, and Ayanna found herself explaining their uses, surprised by his genuine interest. He told her about the maps he was creating, how he tried to note not just distances and elevations, but water sources, seasonal changes, and the signs that showed where people could live in harmony with the land. When the sun reached its peak, Ayanna realized how long she had been gone. Her father would be wondering where she was. "I must go," she said, suddenly aware of how easily the time had passed. "Will I see you again?" Thomas asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by his boldness. Ayanna considered lying, telling him no, that this meeting had been chance and would not be repeated. It would be safer for both of them. But when she looked into his storm-cloud eyes, she found herself saying, "I come here to gather plants every few days. The moon will be dark in 3 nights, and the ghost flower blooms only then." "I'll be working in this area for another week," Thomas said. "Perhaps our paths will cross again." As Ayanna walked away, she felt his eyes following her until she disappeared around the rocks. The pottery shard felt warm in her hand, and she couldn't decide if it was a good omen or a warning. That evening, as she helped her father prepare medicine and her mother worked on a new basket, Ayanna found it hard to concentrate. Her thoughts kept returning to the surveyor with the kind eyes who had treated her ancestors' pottery like treasure. She had met white men before at the trading post, but none had spoken to her as Thomas had, as an equal, someone worth listening to. "You are quiet tonight, daughter," her father observed as they ground healing herbs together. "Did you find what you needed in the canyon?" "Yes, father," Ayanna said, which was true, though she hadn't found what she had expected. "Good. The reservation agent was here today. There is talk of moving more of our people to the San Carlos agency. We may have to leave these mountains soon." Ayanna's hand stilled on the grinding stone. "Leave? But this is our home. Our sacred places are here." "Sacred places live in the heart, not just in the land," her father said gently. "Though I pray we will not have to test that wisdom." That night, Ayanna lay on her sleeping robes, staring up at the stars through the smoke hole in their wickiup. She thought about what her father had said about sacred places, and about Thomas Brennan's words about land that held memories in every stone. She thought about the warmth of his fingers when they had touched, and the way he had looked at her as if she were someone important. She also thought about the stories the older women told about Apache girls who had trusted white men and lived to regret it. But Thomas felt different, and not just because he had shown respect for her ancestors' pottery. There had been something in his manner, a quality she couldn't name but recognized instinctively. 3 nights later, when the moon was dark and the ghost flowers would be blooming in the hidden places of the canyon, Ayanna made her decision. She rose before dawn and prepared her gathering basket with extra care, including special pouches for the rare night-blooming plants. As she walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the canyon, she told herself she was simply following her duty to gather medicine for her people. The ghost flower was powerful medicine, needed for the most serious healing ceremonies. If Thomas Brennan happened to be working in the canyon, it would merely be coincidence. But deep in her heart, she knew she was lying to herself, and the knowledge both thrilled and frightened her. She was walking towards something that could change her life forever, and she was doing it with her eyes wide open. The canyon was still deep in shadow when she arrived, the air cool and fresh with the scent of night-blooming cereus and the lingering perfume of ghost flowers. She moved silently to the place where the flowers grew, tiny white blossoms that seemed to glow in the darkness like fallen stars. As she knelt to gather the precious blooms, she heard the soft nickering of a horse. Her heart skipped as she realized Thomas had come, as she had hoped he would. But where was he? "They're beautiful," came his voice from the shadows nearby. "I've been watching them bloom since midnight. I've never seen anything like it." Ayanna turned toward his voice and saw him sitting quietly against a rock, positioned where he could see the flowers but stay out of her way. He had been waiting for her, respecting her need to gather the medicine first. "They only bloom on the darkest nights," she said, her voice soft in the sacred darkness. "And only for a few hours. By sunrise, they will be closed again." "Like magic," Thomas said, moving closer but still keeping a respectful distance. "Not magic. Medicine. These flowers hold the power to heal the deepest spiritual wounds." Thomas watched as she carefully gathered the blossoms, her movements reverent and precise. "Will you teach me about the plants?" he asked. "Not their locations, I would never ask for that. But their properties, their uses. I would like to understand this land better." Ayanna looked up at him, surprised by the request. No white man had ever asked to learn Apache medicine ways. Most dismissed their healing practices as primitive superstition. "You truly want to know?" "I want to understand everything about this place," Thomas said. "The land, the plants, the people who have lived here for generations. How can I make accurate maps if I don't understand what makes a place truly valuable?" And so, as the ghost flowers bloomed around them in the darkness, Ayanna began to teach Thomas about the healing plants of the desert. She spoke of prickly pear for wounds and inflammation, of desert willow for pain, of creosote for cleansing both body and spirit. Thomas listened with the attention of a student, asking thoughtful questions and showing deep respect for the knowledge she shared. As dawn approached and the ghost flowers began to close, they walked together to the stream where they had first met. The pottery shard from her great-grandmother sat in a place of honor among the rocks, where Ayanna had reverently placed it 3 days before. "I should go," Ayanna said as the eastern sky began to lighten. "My people will be stirring soon." "Ayanna," Thomas said, speaking her name for the first time. She had told it to him during the night, surprised by her own trust. "I leave for Fort Bowie tomorrow to file my survey reports, but I'll be back in a month to map the northern canyons." "The northern canyons are not safe for a man alone," Ayanna said. "There are Apache bands there who have not made peace with the white soldiers." "Will you be there?" The question hung in the cool morning air between them. Ayanna knew what he was really asking and what her answer would mean. "Sometimes," she said finally. "When the healing plants in that region are ready for gathering." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Then perhaps I will be fortunate enough to meet a knowledgeable guide who can help me understand that country as well as you have helped me understand this one." Ayanna felt a smile tug at her lips, despite the seriousness of their situation. "Perhaps you will, Thomas Brennan. But such a guide would expect you to continue learning about the plants and their uses. I would consider myself honored by such teaching." As Ayanna walked home through the brightening canyon, she carried more than healing plants in her basket. She carried the memory of storm-gray eyes full of respect and kindness, of gentle hands that treated ancient pottery like treasure, and of a voice that spoke of her people's knowledge as wisdom rather than superstition. She also carried the knowledge that her life had taken a turn towards something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. But for the first time since the white men had come to Apache lands in great numbers, she had met one who saw the desert as she did, who wanted to learn rather than simply take. Whether that would prove to be her salvation or her downfall, only time would tell. But as she watched the sun rise over the mountains, her people had called home for generations beyond counting. Ayanna knew she would be in the northern canyons when Thomas Brennan returned. A month passed, like a slow-moving river, each day bringing Ayanna both anticipation and worry. She found herself walking to high places where she could see the trails leading into Apache country, watching for the dust of a solitary rider. When her mother asked why she spent so much time gathering plants that were not yet ready for harvest, Ayanna made excuses about learning new locations before the seasonal rains changed the landscape. The truth was more complicated than she could explain to anyone. During their night conversations among the ghost flowers, something had awakened in her heart that she had never expected to feel. Thomas Brennan had shown her that not all white men saw her people as obstacles to be removed or curiosities to be studied. He saw them as human beings with wisdom worth learning. More troubling was the way her pulse quickened when she remembered his laugh, or how safe she had felt sitting beside him in the darkness. These feelings went against everything she had been taught about the dangers of trusting outsiders, especially white men who came to Apache lands with surveys and maps. News from the outside world reached her people regularly through traders and messengers moving between the scattered bands. Each report made Ayanna's stomach tighten with worry. More Apache families were being forced onto reservations. Soldiers were increasing patrols along the mountain trails. The territorial government was offering bounties for information about Apache camps. In such times, any association with a white surveyor could bring disaster to her family. Yet when the day came that she spotted a familiar horse and rider picking their way carefully up the canyon trail, Ayanna's heart soared despite her fears. Thomas had kept his word, returning exactly when he had promised, but he looked different now, more weathered and cautious. His clothes showed hard travel, and there was a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he saw her waiting by the stream where they had first met, his face brightened with relief and something deeper. "I wasn't certain you would come," he said, dismounting and approaching her slowly. "I wasn't certain you would return," Ayanna replied. "The soldiers have been very active on the trails." "I know. I had to take a longer route to avoid the patrols. They're nervous about Apache raiding parties, though I suspect the raids are responses to the increased pressure on the reservations." Ayanna nodded approvingly. Thomas understood the cause and effect that most white men missed or ignored. "How was your time at the fort?" she asked. Thomas's expression darkened. "Educational. I learned that my surveys are being used for purposes I hadn't intended. The water sources I mapped to help settlers find suitable places to live are also being used by the Army to locate and cut off Apache camps." The confession hung between them like a storm cloud. Ayanna felt her breath catch as the implications sank in. Thomas's work, however well-intentioned, was being turned into a weapon against her people. "You could have not told me this," she said carefully. "I could have," Thomas agreed. "But lying to you would have been worse than the betrayal of my maps being misused. You trusted me with sacred knowledge. I owe you honesty in return." They walked together deeper into the canyon, away from any possible watchers. The northern canyons were indeed more dangerous, as Ayanna had warned, but not just because of Apache war parties. Confederate sympathizers and Mexican bandits also used the remote trails, and the territorial government's control was weak in the mountainous regions. "What will you do?" Ayanna asked as they found a sheltered spot beside a small waterfall. "I'm going to be more careful about what I include in my official reports," Thomas said. "Water sources that serve Apache camps will be marked differently in my personal notes, but left vague in the maps I submit to the territory. It's not much, but it's something. It is dangerous for you. If they discover what you are doing, if I don't do it, I'm contributing to the destruction of your people. If I do it, I'm risking my career and possibly my freedom." Thomas sat on a flat rock and looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes. "It's not really a choice, is it?" Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Here was a white man willing to risk himself for Apache lives, not because he loved her, but because it was right. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Over the following weeks, Thomas established a base camp in a hidden canyon, several miles from where Ayana's band was staying for the summer gathering season. She visited him every few days, ostensibly to continue teaching him about desert plants, but really because she craved his company more than she wanted to admit. Their friendship deepened with each meeting. Thomas shared stories of his childhood in Ohio, of green landscapes so different from the desert that Ayana could barely imagine them. He told her about his dreams of mapping the entire Southwest in a way that honored both the land and its native peoples. Ayana spoke of Apache traditions, of the complex relationships between different bands, and of her father's growing worries about their people's future. Thomas proved to be a quick student of plant medicine, showing particular interest in how different preparations could heal different ailments. Ayana found herself looking forward to his questions, the way he truly listened, the respect he showed for knowledge that most whites dismissed as primitive superstition. "Your people have had thousands of years to learn this land's secrets," Thomas said one afternoon, as Ayana showed him how to properly harvest the inner bark of a willow tree. "My people have been here a few decades and think they know everything." "The arrogance is staggering when you really think about it." "Not all your people are arrogant," Ayana said, glancing at him meaningfully. "No," Thomas replied, catching her look, "but too many are, and the arrogant ones usually have the most power." It was during their 5th week of meetings that the incident happened that would be whispered about in Apache camps and frontier towns for years to come. They had been gathering plants in a particularly remote section of the canyon, a place where ancient petroglyphs covered the walls and the silence felt sacred. Thomas had been helping Ayana reach some high-growing medicinal moss when she slipped on the loose rock. He caught her instinctively, his strong arms pulling her against his chest to keep her from falling. For a moment, they stood frozen in that embrace. Her hands pressed against his shirt, his arms around her waist. The world seemed to hold its breath around them. Slowly, without speaking, Thomas lifted one hand to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "Ayana," he whispered, her name like a prayer on his lips. When he leaned down to kiss her, Ayana felt as if lightning had struck her very soul. The kiss was gentle but full of longing, speaking of feelings they had both been trying to deny. She kissed him back with equal passion, her heart racing with joy and terror in equal measure. They might have stayed lost in that moment forever, but the sound of voices carried across the canyon rocks, causing them to spring apart like deer startled by hunters. "Someone is coming," Ayana whispered, her face flushed with emotion and alarm. The voices grew closer, and Ayana recognized them with growing horror. Her cousin Kachina was approaching with 2 of the young Apache warriors, probably searching for Ayana when she didn't return from her gathering expedition at the expected time. "They cannot see you with me," Ayana said urgently. "If they find a white man here with me—" Thomas understood immediately. Discovery would mean death for him and disgrace for her, possibly exile from her people. But there was nowhere for him to hide in the open area where they had been gathering plants. "Go to them," Thomas said, backing away toward a cluster of boulders. "I'll find a way to disappear." But Kachina's voice was too close now, and Ayana could hear the warriors with her discussing the best way to search the canyon. In moments, they would round the bend and see everything. Panic filled Ayana's mind until desperation sparked an idea. Without thinking it through, she knelt quickly and grabbed a sharp piece of stone, using it to scratch 2 small marks on her bare ankle, just deep enough to draw blood. Then she threw herself down beside a large rock and began crying out in apparent pain. "Help me!" she called in Apache. "A rattler bit me! Help!" The sound of her distress brought Kachina and the warriors running. They found Ayana clutching her ankle, tears streaming down her face, alone in the canyon with her scattered gathering basket beside her. "Where is the snake?" demanded Chato, one of the warriors, immediately scanning the rocks for the dangerous reptile. "It went that way," Ayana sobbed, pointing in the opposite direction from where Thomas had disappeared. "Into the rocks. I was reaching for the healing moss when it struck. Kachina knelt beside her cousin, examining the small wounds on her ankle with experienced eyes. The bite is not deep, she said with relief. But we must get you to your father immediately. Rattlesnake venom works quickly. As the two warriors carried Ayanna between them back toward the camp, she caught a glimpse of Thomas watching from behind a distant boulder. Their eyes met for just an instant across the canyon, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of relief and anguish that filled her own heart. The next hour was a blur of activity as Nalnish worked to treat what he believed was a genuine snake bite. Ayanna felt terrible lying to her beloved father, watching him perform the sacred healing ceremonies and apply the powerful medicine that would draw venom from her blood. But she endured it all, knowing that the alternative, revealing the truth, would bring disaster on everyone she loved. The treatment was exhausting, involving herbal preparations that made her sick to her stomach and ritual chanting that continued deep into the night. By morning, when it became clear that Ayanna would recover fully, the entire camp was buzzing with talk of her close call. "You were fortunate, daughter," Nalnish told her as she rested on her sleeping robes. "The snake must have given you only a small amount of venom, or perhaps the medicine moss you were gathering helped protect you. But you must be more careful in the high places. The spirits saved you this time." Ayanna nodded weakly, the guilt of her deception weighing heavier than any snake bite ever could. She had involved the spirits in her lie, made a mockery of her father's sacred healing powers, all to protect a secret that was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. For 3 days, she was confined to the camp to recover. During that time, runners brought news that made her blood run cold. Soldiers had been seen in the northern canyons, tracking someone or something with great determination. Apache scouts reported that the patrol was following the trail of a lone white man who seemed to know the country well enough to stay ahead of them. Thomas was in terrible danger, and there was nothing Ayanna could do to warn him without revealing their connection. She lay on her robes, staring at the bandages on her ankle that covered her self-inflicted wounds, and wondered if her moment of desperate thinking had saved them both or doomed them. On the 4th day, as she was finally allowed to move around the camp normally, a commotion arose near the horse herd. Riders were approaching under a white flag, and as they drew closer, Ayanna's heart nearly stopped. Thomas Brennan rode at the center of a small group that included 2 Apache scouts she recognized, and a man she didn't know wearing the clothes of a territorial official. Thomas's hands were bound, and his face was grim with resignation. "We seek Nalnish, medicine man of this band," called one of the scouts in Apache. "This white man claims to have information about threats to your people, but he is also accused of helping Apache raiders avoid army patrols. The territorial agent wishes to question him in your presence." Ayanna watched from behind her mother's cooking fire as her father emerged from their wickiup to speak with the visitors. Thomas's eyes swept the camp until they found her, and for a moment his expression softened with relief that she was safe. Then he looked away, being careful not to stare in her direction. "What information does this white man claim to have?" Nalnish asked in careful English, his voice neutral but watchful. "I have maps," Thomas said clearly. "Maps that show water sources your people use, trails you follow, places you gather medicine plants. These maps are being used by the Army to hunt Apache families. I came here to warn you because I believe it is wrong." The territorial agent, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Mr. Brennan is under investigation for treason. He admits to withholding information from his survey reports and claims to be protecting hostile Indians." "We are not hostile," Nalnish replied with dignity. "We are trying to survive in the land of our ancestors." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted most of the day. Thomas had indeed come to warn them. carrying copies of the Army's plans to seal off water sources and force the Apache bands out of the mountains. But in doing so, he had confirmed the suspicions of his superiors that he was more sympathetic to the Apache than to his own government. As the sun began to set, a deal was struck that satisfied no one but prevented immediate bloodshed. Thomas would be taken to Fort Bowie for questioning, but not as a prisoner. Instead, he would be reassigned to duties that didn't involve sensitive intelligence, essentially ending his surveying career. In return, Nalnish agreed to consider moving his people to the safer but more restricted environment of the reservation before winter set in. As the group prepared to leave, Thomas managed to catch Ayana's eye one last time. Without speaking, he touched his fingers briefly to his lips, then to his heart, a gesture so quick that anyone watching would think he was simply adjusting his shirt. But Ayana understood. He was telling her that their kiss would live in his heart forever, no matter what happened next. That night, as the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Ayana sat beside the dying cooking fire and touched her own fingers to the place on her ankle, where she had scratched false snakebite marks. The wounds were healing well, leaving only faint scars that would fade with time. But the memory of Thomas's kiss and the desperate lie she had told to protect them both would remain fresh in her mind forever. She had discovered love in the most impossible place, with the most impossible person, at the most impossible time. And now she faced a future where that love could only survive in secret memories and stolen moments, like ghost flowers that bloomed only in darkness and faded with the dawn. Winter came early to the Arizona Territory that year, bringing with it changes that no one could have predicted. The first snow fell in October, covering the high mountains and making travel difficult for everyone, Apache and white settler alike. It was during this season of enforced isolation that the consequences of Thomas and Ayana's forbidden relationship would finally play out. After Thomas was taken away for questioning, Ayana threw herself into the daily work of preparing her people for the cold months ahead. She gathered winter medicines with renewed dedication, helped preserve meat from the autumn hunts, and spent long hours weaving baskets that would be needed to store supplies. To any observer, she appeared to be a dutiful Apache daughter, focused entirely on her people's survival. But inside, her heart remained divided. During the day, she could sometimes forget about the gentle surveyor with storm-gray eyes. The demands of winter preparation kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. It was during the long nights that his memory haunted her. When she would lie on her sleeping robes, remembering the warmth of his arms and the tenderness of their single kiss. News from the outside world came sporadically through traders brave enough to risk the mountain passes. Ayana listened hungrily to every report, hoping for some word of Thomas's fate. What she learned troubled her deeply. The territorial government was cracking down on anyone suspected of Apache sympathies. Several traders had been arrested for selling supplies to reservation natives. A missionary who had spoken out against forced relocations had been reassigned to a distant post. Thomas Brennan had disappeared entirely from official records, as if he had never existed. "Perhaps he has gone back east to his own people," her mother suggested when Ayana's distraction became too obvious to ignore. "White men rarely stay in our country when the government turns against them." Ayana nodded as if she agreed, but her heart rejected the possibility. The Thomas she had known was not the kind of man who would abandon people in need, even to save himself. If he had vanished, there had to be another reason. Her answer came in the depths of winter, during the season when Apache families traditionally told stories around fires and shared the wisdom of their elders. Nalnish was treating a young warrior who had been injured in a fall when a stranger appeared at the edge of camp, moving silently through the snow like a ghost. At first glance, the figure looked like any other winter traveler bundled in heavy furs and blankets against the cold. But when he lowered the hood that shadowed his face, Ayana's breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas, but changed almost beyond recognition. His face was leaner, marked by exposure and hardship. His hair had grown long and was braided in the Apache style. Most startling of all, he moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned to survive in the wilderness on Apache terms. When he spoke, it was in careful but passable Apache, addressing Nalnish with the proper respectful phrases. "I seek the medicine man Nalnish," he said. "I bring news of danger to your people, and I ask for the hospitality of your fire." The entire camp was electrified by the appearance of the white man who spoke their language and showed no fear, despite being outnumbered 50-1. Warriors reached for their weapons, but Nalnish raised a hand to stop them. "I know this man," the medicine man said calmly. "He came before, risking his life to warn us of the army's plans. Speak, Thomas Brennan. What news do you bring?" Thomas glanced around the circle of suspicious faces until his eyes found Ayanna's. For just an instant, she saw relief and joy flash across his features before he forced his attention back to her father. "The territorial governor has approved a winter campaign against all Apache bands not currently on reservations," Thomas said. 3 columns of soldiers will move into the mountains as soon as the weather clears. They plan to use the spring water sources as bait, poisoning the streams and forcing your people into the open. A shocked murmur ran through the camp. Even the most experienced warriors were appalled by the idea of poisoning water sources. Such an act violated every code of honorable warfare, white or Apache. "How do you know this?" asked Chato, the young warrior who had helped carry Ayanna after her supposed snakebite. "Because I helped plan the campaign," Thomas said grimly. "Before I was reassigned, I was ordered to provide detailed maps of every water source in Apache territory. When I refused, they threatened to court-martial me for treason. When I still refused, they discharged me from government service and confiscated all my equipment." "But you are here," Nalnish observed. "How did you learn of these plans?" Thomas's smile held no humor. "I may no longer be a government surveyor, but I still have friends among the soldiers at Fort Bowie, men who joined the army to fight enemies, not to poison water holes used by women and children. One of them brought me word of the plan and a copy of the maps being used." He pulled a leather pouch from inside his heavy coat and removed several carefully folded papers. Even from across the fire, Ayanna could see that they were detailed maps showing water sources, traditional campsites, and seasonal travel routes throughout the region. "These maps show every place your people might seek water during the spring melt," Thomas continued. "The Army plans to reach each location first and contaminate the water with mineral salts that will make it undrinkable. They believe this will force all Apache bands to surrender and accept relocation to the San Carlos Reservation." The silence that followed was profound. Ayanna watched her father study the maps, his face grave with the implications. Without clean water sources, her people would indeed be forced to surrender or die of thirst. It was a strategy of starvation disguised as military tactics. "Why do you tell us this?" Nalnish asked finally. "You are no longer bound by loyalty to your government, but neither do you owe anything to the Apache." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames held the answer he sought. When he looked up, his gaze found Ayanna again, and this time he didn't look away. "I owe a debt to your people," he said. "You trusted me with sacred knowledge. You showed me the true value of this land and taught me to see it as more than territory to be mapped and claimed. You treated me with honor when I had done nothing to deserve it." He paused, then added softly, "And someone dear to me would never forgive me if I failed to act when I could have helped." Ayanna felt heat rise to her cheeks, certain that everyone around the fire could see the truth written in her face. But the others were too focused on the immediate crisis to notice the subtle exchange between her and Thomas. "What do you propose we do?" Chato asked. "We cannot fight 3 columns of soldiers with winter supplies running low and our warriors scattered across many camps." You can't fight them, Thomas agreed, but you can avoid them. I know their routes, their timing, their supply lines. More importantly, I know water sources that aren't on any government map, places your people could shelter until the campaign collapses. Over the next hour, Thomas outlined a plan that was as audacious as it was desperate. Instead of fleeing to the reservations, the Apache bands would move to a series of hidden springs and seasonal water sources that existed in the most remote parts of the mountains. These locations were known only to a few medicine men and experienced hunters, places so difficult to reach that no army patrol would attempt to find them in winter conditions. The government expects this campaign to be over quickly, Thomas explained. They're counting on your surrender within a few weeks. If you can hold out until late spring, the political pressure to end the expensive military operation will force them to negotiate. And what of you? Nalnish asked. If you help us, there will be no place for you among your own people. There's no place for me there now anyway, Thomas replied. I've burned those bridges. But if your people would accept me, I could be useful. I know the country, I speak enough Apache to get by, and I understand how the army thinks and moves. The debate that followed continued deep into the night. Some warriors argued that trusting any white man was folly. Others pointed out that Thomas had already proven his good faith by risking everything to bring them this warning. The older men spoke of similar situations in the past, when their people had been forced to choose between certain death and uncertain survival. Ayanna said nothing during the discussions, though her heart raced every time someone suggested that Thomas should be sent away. She forced herself to remain silent, knowing that any advocacy on her part might raise suspicions about their relationship. Finally, as dawn approached, Nalnish made the decision that would determine the fate of everyone in the camp. We will follow the plan, he announced. The risk of staying is greater than the risk of fleeing to the hidden places. But, he added, fixing Thomas with a stern gaze, you will prove your loyalty through actions, not words. If you betray us, the consequences will be severe. I understand, Thomas said solemnly. I ask for nothing more than the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust. The next weeks were a blur of preparation and movement. Following Thomas's intelligence about the army's timing, the camp broke apart into smaller groups that would travel separately to different hiding places. Ayanna found herself assigned to a group that included her parents, several elders, and a handful of children, people who needed the most protection and could least afford to be caught by military patrols. Thomas was assigned to the same group, officially because his knowledge of the terrain would be valuable, but Ayanna suspected her father had other motives. Nalnish was too wise not to have noticed the way his daughter and the white surveyor looked at each other, and too practical not to want them where he could watch them both. The journey to their hiding place was arduous, following trails so faint they were barely visible and climbing through passes that required ropes and careful planning. Thomas proved invaluable as a guide, using his surveying skills to navigate by stars and landmarks even when snow obscured the traditional trail markers. But more than his technical knowledge, Thomas demonstrated the character that had first drawn Ayanna to him. He helped elderly travelers without being asked, shared his rations with children who were still hungry after meals, and never complained about the harsh conditions, despite being unaccustomed to such deprivation. Most importantly, he showed deep respect for Apache customs and traditions. When they stopped at sacred sites along the trail, he waited patiently while prayers were offered. When the medicine men performed ceremonies for protection and guidance, he participated reverently in whatever ways were appropriate for an outsider. Their destination was a hidden valley high in the mountains, accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended. A natural spring provided fresh water year-round, and ancient cave shelters offered protection from the worst winter weather. It was a place known only to the oldest medicine men, a sanctuary that had sheltered Apache families during times of crisis for countless generations. As they settled into their winter refuge, a routine developed that allowed Ayanna and Thomas to spend time together without attracting attention. He helped her gather firewood and medicinal plants, claiming he wanted to continue his education about desert botany. She taught him more Apache words and phrases, explaining that better communication would help him serve the group more effectively. These innocent activities gave them opportunities to talk privately, though they were always careful to maintain appropriate distance when others might be watching. The memory of their kiss remained unspoken between them, a secret treasure that neither dared acknowledge openly. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside their cave shelter, Ayanna found herself sitting beside Thomas as they worked on repairing snowshoes for the children. The rest of the group was gathered around the central fire, listening to Nalnish tell winter stories, their voices creating a comfortable murmur that masked quiet conversation. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked softly, not specifying what "it" meant, but knowing Thomas would understand. "Which part?" he replied with a slight smile. "Meeting you? Warning your people? Giving up my career? Spending the winter in a cave?" "Any of it. All of it." Thomas was quiet for a moment, carefully working leather bindings through the wooden frame of a snowshoe. "I regret that my maps were used to threaten your people," he said finally. "I regret that my good intentions helped create a weapon that could have destroyed families. But the rest of it?" He glanced at her, his eyes warm in the firelight. "No, I don't regret any of the rest of it." "Even though it has cost you everything you worked for?" "What I worked for was never really mine anyway. I was just borrowing it from a government that I discovered I couldn't serve with honor. But this," he gestured to the cave around them, the sound of Apache voices telling ancient stories, the sense of community that had developed among the refugees. "This feels real in a way that drawing lines on maps never did." Ayanna felt tears threaten behind her eyes. Here was a man who had given up everything familiar for the chance to do what was right, who had found meaning in a life completely different from anything he had ever imagined. "My people may never fully trust you," she warned. "There will always be some who see you as an outsider." "Then I'll spend however long it takes earning that trust," Thomas replied. "I've got nowhere else to go and nothing else I'd rather be doing." The winter was long and hard, but their small community survived. Thomas's information about army movements proved accurate, and the military patrols never came close to finding their hidden valley. Word filtered in through carefully maintained contacts that the government's campaign was indeed failing, with soldiers finding abandoned campsites but no Apache families to capture. As spring approached and it became safe to return to lower elevations, Ayanna realized that the crisis had changed her relationship with Thomas in ways that went beyond their growing feelings for each other. They had worked together through months of hardship, had proven to each other that their different backgrounds could become sources of strength rather than division. More importantly, Thomas had proven himself to her people. Even the most suspicious warriors acknowledged that he had kept his word, sharing danger and privation without complaint while never forgetting that he was a guest in their world. When Nalnish announced that it was time to leave their winter refuge, he made another announcement that surprised everyone. "The white man Thomas has asked permission to stay with our people permanently," the medicine man said. "He offers his skills and knowledge in service to our survival. I have decided to grant this request, but with conditions." Ayanna's heart stopped as her father continued speaking. "He will be adopted into our clan through proper ceremony, taking an Apache name and accepting the obligations that come with belonging to our people. He will learn our ways completely, not as a visitor, but as a member of our family. And he will take a wife from among us, creating ties that cannot be broken by the changing winds of politics." The old man's eyes found his daughter's face, and Ayanna saw understanding and acceptance there. "My daughter Ayanna has spoken for him," Nalnish said calmly. "She believes he is worthy of our trust and of her love. If she still feels this way when the summer ceremonies begin, I will not oppose their marriage." The silence that followed was broken by Thomas's voice, speaking carefully in Apache. "I am honored beyond words," he said, "but I will not accept this gift unless Ayanna chooses freely. I want no wife who comes to me from duty rather than love." All eyes turned to Ayanna, who felt as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Everything she had dreamed of during the long winter nights was being offered to her openly, but the choice was entirely hers to make. She thought of the kiss they had shared in the canyon, of the false snake-bite story that had protected them both, of the months they had spent learning to trust each other completely. She thought of the children Thomas had helped during their winter exile, the elders he had cared for without complaint, the way he had embraced Apache ways while never pretending to be something he wasn't. "I choose freely," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I choose love over safety, hope over fear, and a future we will build together." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with people coming from scattered camps to witness the unprecedented union between the Apache Maiden and the white surveyor who had become more Apache than many born to the tribe. When Thomas received his new name, "He who maps with honor," even the oldest warriors nodded approval. Years later, when their children asked about how their parents had met, Ayanna would tell them the story of the ghost flowers that bloomed only in darkness, of maps that protected rather than betrayed, and of a love that began with shared respect for the sacred places of the earth. She would also tell them about the day she pretended a rattlesnake had bitten her, covering the small wounds on her ankle that masked a much deeper truth. It had been her first lie in service of love, but not her last. "Sometimes," she would say with a smile, "the heart knows truths that cannot be spoken aloud until the world is ready to hear them." And when the children asked if she ever regretted her choice, Ayanna would look across their small farm, built where a seasonal stream provided water for both Apache medicinal plants and Thomas's carefully surveyed fields, and watch their father teaching young Apache boys the art of mapping while learning from them the deeper art of reading the land's stories. "Never," she would say, touching the faint scars on her ankle that had long since faded to silver lines. "Not for a single day?"